The first step in creating our tapered octagonal planter boxes is to set an accurate protractor, in this case an electronic one, to 96.1 degrees. Now this is going to be used for creating some jigs that are going to give us the correct 6.1 degree taper angle for our staves for the planter boxes. Now I'm going to use the protractor to accurately set my bevel square to 96.1 degrees. To make the process of cutting our tapered planter box staves more safe and accurate, we're going to build 3 different jigs, one used for each step in the cutting process. The jig used for the first stave cut is made from a rectangular piece of 1/4-inch plywood with a narrow wood strip fence glued atop it. Here I'm using my set bevel gauge to align the strip with the square back edge of the plywood. To fix the fence strip in place, I'm going to place a few drops of cyanoacrylate glue along the strip. Then I'm going to use a special cyanoacrylate accelerator to quickly dry the glue. Once the gluing is done, I'm going to use my bevel gauge to once again check the angle of the fence strip. Now here I'm taking one of the stave blanks that's been cut to final length, and I'm aligning one end of it flush with the end of the fence strip. And I'm going to use this blank to align the stop strip at the back of the jig. I'm going to hold it in place and once again use our cyanoacrylate glue and accelerator to fix it in place. The jig used to make the second cut on each stave is built just like the first one, except that its fence angles in the opposite direction and is aligned at a 12.2 angle to achieve the proper taper for the second cut. It also has a stop strip and a taller fence that's required to align the workpiece properly. The third jig is used to create the 2 half staves that are required for each half octagonal planter box. This jig's fence is also aligned at 6.1 degrees, and it has a support block at the end and a handle that's used to make the jig safer and easier to use. In preparation for making the first 2 cuts on each stave, I set the blade tilt of my table saw to 21.7 degrees, using a bevel square that's been set to 111.7. After loading a stave blank into the first cutting jig, I set the height of my table saw blade so it's just slightly higher than the thickness of the workpiece. Now I bring the fence over so that the top edge of the blade will just cut at the edge of the blank, and I make my first cut, which I repeat on all the staves. After flipping the piece I just cut around end for end, I load it into the second stave cutting jig and bevel its other edge. The first time I use this second cutting jig, I measure the wide end of the stave to make sure its front is exactly 5 inches wide. If it's not, I reset the table saw fence as necessary. Before using the third stave cutting jig, I mount a narrow curved blade to my table saw and set it square. I then set the saw's rip fence so the center line of the jig will be perfectly aligned with the saw blade. I take one of the staves that will be split in half, flip it over so it's front side down, and the narrow end is towards the back end of the jig. To keep the stave in place during sawing, I use some wide masking tape, which I press onto one edge of the stave and then down onto the fence strip. After setting the saw blade height, I go ahead and hold the strip with a push block and use the handle to push the jig and stave through the cut. I use the same thin kerf saw blade and square saw setting along with a miter gauge set to 15 degrees to cut the 2 taper angles on the back of each planter box. Now I take my back blank that's been sawn to final length, press it against the miter saw fence, and cut the first tapered edge. To taper the back's other edge, I flip it over and then I set the edge against a stop that's positioned to produce a cut that's 10 5/8 at the widest end. Make sure and save all the cutoff scraps as you'll need them when gluing up the planter box later on. Once all the staves are cut, you're ready for the fun part, gluing everything together. Now position 2 half staves and 3 full staves on the bench top face up and make sure all edges and ends are completely butted up together and flush. Instead of using any sort of regular clamps on this, we're going to use a neat trick which involves masking tape. Rip a piece of masking tape that's long enough to fully cover each joint seam between pieces. And just apply it centered on the seam. And then once all the staves are taped together, then go ahead and use your fingers to press down the tape firmly so that there are no air bubbles and everything's nice and tight. Using this technique, you'll be able to essentially roll up each half octagonal planter box, just like this. Now then, take one of the backs and flip the taped planter assembly over. Now in order for this polyurethane glue we're going to use to work, you actually have to dampen one side of each joint. So here I'm using a sponge and I'm just applying a little bit of moisture to one half of each joint. Once that's done, here's my polyurethane glue. I'm going to apply a narrow bead to each opposite joint surface. Now here you really don't want to apply too much glue because polyurethane glue tends to foam and you don't want to make a huge mess. Once the glue is applied, do just as before and roll the assembly up. And now flip it over so that the flat side of each half stave is down on the bench. Slide one of the backs in place, but do not apply glue to it at this time. It will be glued later on. Now here are your cutoff scraps, the 15-degree scraps from cutting the backs. Put one on either side and just lightly apply a couple of clamps. And this will keep the planter in the correct position for the joints to be nice and tight as the glue dries. I apply one clamp at the top of the assembly and another one down at the bottom. Once again, it's not necessary to apply a tremendous amount of clamping pressure. What is important, though, is once the clamps are on, to carefully flip the entire assembly over. Once again, the polyurethane glue tends to foam, and you don't want that foam running down onto the back, which you're going to glue on later on.